When you think of the ideal sub-weapon for whatever weapon you like to play, what do you want that sub-weapon to achieve? Should it cover your weapon's weaknesses to keep you flexible and adaptable? Should it combo with your weapon's strengths and let you go all in on one specific playstyle? Or maybe you're more of a team player and you just want to reliably help your teammates out with their own fights. Most weapon kits will fall into one or two of these categories, but one sub-weapon in particular finds its way into all three situations due to its plethora of unique properties, so long as you have the creativity and skills to use them properly. You read the title. Today we're talking about Angle Shooter. Hello, I'm Pika, a high-level Splatoon coach and competitive player, and welcome back. This is the second episode in my guide series. I'll go over every utility sub-weapon in the game, or in other words, any sub-weapon that is not a bomb. If you missed the first episode on Toxic Mist, I'll leave a link below so you can check it out after this. Angle Shooter is a new sub-weapon in Splatoon 3, so not only is there still much for people to learn about it, but it's also been undergoing significant balance changes so far since launch, and more are still possible to come later. This guide is up to date with version 4.0, so any further balance changes made to the sub after this point will be noted in the top of the description and in the comments, so they're easy to check up on. With that out of the way, let's dive into the stats and properties of Angle Shooter, of which there are many, before we go too deep. As of version 4.0, Angle Shooter takes 40% of your ink tank to throw out by default, making it the cheapest sub-weapon in the game to use since Burst Bomb's recent nerf to 45%. There are two major components to Angle Shooter: the marker that you throw, and the tail that it leaves behind. The marker is the core of the sub-weapon, so it's what we're most concerned with, but we will come back to the tail later. The marker essentially acts as a bullet that flies forward at an incredibly high velocity and range, moving in a straight line unaffected by gravity. If the marker hits a surface, it will create a patch of ink there, reflect off that surface, and keep moving straight in the new direction for the remainder of its distance. There's no limit to how many times the marker can bounce around before its duration runs out, so perhaps you're already seeing just how creative you can get with this thing. If the marker hits an opponent directly, it'll deal 35 damage to them, mark them for 5 seconds like a point sensor does, and it will spawn a small patch of ink underneath the target if they're on the ground. This means any opponent you hit directly will lose a chunk of their health, be easily visible to you and all of your team anywhere on the map, and they'll likely have their movement hindered for a moment due to the turf that just appeared underneath them. Also, mentioning that the marker acts like a bullet wasn't just to describe its motion, but also some additional properties. Most sub-weapons follow similar trends, like being physical objects that cannot pass through gratings, or that get absorbed when contacting specials like Booyah Bomb and Ink Strike, but Angle Shooter doesn't follow these rules. Just like shots from your main weapon, they'll move past and through those things I just mentioned without any interference. We also can't forget the tail. The line that Angle Shooter leaves behind lingers directly in the path that the marker took for 1.5 seconds before disappearing. If enemies make contact with this tail at any point, it won't deal any damage or produce any ink, but it will mark their location for the same 5-second duration as the marker itself. Since Angle Shooter costs less than half of your ink tank to use, you can throw 2 in a row without needing any ink saver sub. It is possible to get the ink cost below 1/3 of your tank to use 3 in a row if you really wanted to, but it takes a whopping 36 ability points worth of ink saver sub, or 3 main slots and 2 sub slots minimum to reach. Since this investment is so demanding, and since the white ink, or ink recovery time after using the sub is already pretty low at only 50 frames, it isn't worth committing to a triple marker build seriously, and I'd only suggest it if you're doing it for the meme. While we're talking about abilities though, enemies wearing sub resistance up will take less damage from marker direct hits, and will have the duration of the sensor effect from both the marker and the tail reduced. Wearing sub power up will very slightly increase the maximum range the marker can fly, it will much more noticeably increase the duration of the point sensor effect. Getting just a tiny increase to your range from sub power might sound pretty strange and pointless, but I don't think I did Angle Shooter justice for just how absurd its default range actually is. Even without any sub power, if a marker flies straight without any bounces, it already has the longest range of anything in the game, and it isn't even close. E-liters, Trizookas, crab tanks, none of them hold a candle to the range this thing has, so it realistically doesn't need any more than its default. Yes, this means this is a sub-weapon that can fly at essentially hit-scan velocity across the map and deal damage to and mark even your longest range opponents without them having enough range to shoot back at you, granted you get the spacing right of course. Sure, one marker may only do 35 damage to them, but throw 2 in a row like you always can, now that's 70 damage. Enough to make that enemy who's quite literally halfway across the map from you weak enough to get finished off by anything any teammate might also shoot or throw at them. And since you can recover ink so quickly after using Angle Shooter, you might even get the ink back in time to throw a third marker and finish that player off all on your own if they don't move away in time. It sounds silly and it's definitely not an easy thing to pull off, but it is possible with any Angle Shooter weapon, and I've gotten away with it more times than I realistically should. You can bully any player from essentially anywhere while being outside of their range, weakening and marking them to make them an easy kill for your teammates to finish off, or even spotting an enemy running away from a fight that your teammate started and using the marker to trap them in ink and stop them in their tracks, or just splat them outright if their health is already low. I'm getting ahead of myself though. There's another mechanic I want to revisit and explain a bit further. We mentioned already how markers will reflect off of surfaces that they contact and keep flying. This is true, but the specifics to how it works might not be as consistent as you might think. When contacting a horizontal wall, the marker will bounce off that wall at the same angle it came in from as you'd expect it to. Simple enough. For any fellow blah blobber enjoyers out there, I know y'all are familiar with these angles. However, things get a little strange when you bounce markers off the ground. If you aim the sub-weapon down at the ground, you expect it to bounce back up into the sky at a pretty harsh angle, right? But that isn't actually what happens. For whatever reason, angle shooters will take extremely shallow angles when bouncing off the floor. This is surely strange, but in my experience this is actually incredibly helpful. Since angle shooters that bounce off the floor still remain close to the ground after the fact, it becomes a lot more forgiving to aim direct hits at enemies vertically. Since if you aim too low but you have the shot lined up horizontally, the marker is still likely to hit them instead of going way above their head. This is especially helpful when aiming at someone on a lower elevation than yourself, where the vertical element of aiming becomes more prevalent. My favorite of all though is that this mechanic actually opens up a neat multi-purpose trick with angle shooters. See, since markers will create a decent patch of ink on any surface they hit, you can throw markers directly underneath yourself anytime you're stuck in enemy ink to give yourself a quick movement option. This alone is a great option to have. But since markers also bounce off the floor like this, it means that if you paint underneath yourself with a marker while also having your camera oriented towards an enemy, that same marker that just painted your feet can also end up directing them if they're close enough, trapping them too and softening up their health bar if you want to choose to rush them down with the movement option you just gave yourself. Certain angle shooter weapons appreciate this trick far more than others, but we'll get into that shortly. Before I do talk about any particular angle shooter weapons though, I once again want to talk about the tail that the marker leaves behind. Due to its simple and secondary nature, the tail is the most universal aspect of angle shooter that I think all weapons with the sub want to use more or less the same way. Since the marker itself does not pierce through enemies, if you want to maximize the range and coverage of the tail, you might want to intentionally avoid hitting enemies with the direct hit of the marker so the tail can actually reach its full length. This full range can be used most effectively in open, flat spaces that any other information tool such as a point sensor can't fully cover. Sometimes when approaching an open area full of enemy ink, I'll send a marker straight through the middle of it and choose to fight on one side of it, effectively creating a tripwire. This forms a split, makes it so that any enemies who either try to run from the side I'm fighting on to the other, or from the other side trying to rush over to help their teammates, will be known right away as they hit the tail and get marked. Again, they won't receive any damage like they would from a direct hit, but that information can still be very valuable in helping you and your teammates decide who to focus on when in your fights. And since angle shooters are so cheap and quick to throw out, there's usually little reason not to set this up when you can. This isn't to say that bouncing markers off of walls and tight spaces isn't useful for the tail too though. In much the same way as subs like sensors, torpedoes, and autobombs can help you pinpoint enemies as you push forward, when the terrain allows for it, you can send an angle shooter around a corner that you wish to push into and let it bounce around on the other side. It'll mark anyone there so long as they hit either the marker itself or the tail. This is rather situational since it relies on another surface being nearby that the marker can initially bounce back from, so it's best for maps with enclosed spaces and hallways, my favorite for this being Manta Maria. To briefly recap all the uses and qualities of angle shooter we've talked about, it is the cheapest sub in the game, it has the most range of anything in the game, it has a mostly unique bouncing mechanic, it can split space and get information with the marker tail, and direct hits from the marker can give quick chip damage and information, give you a quick mobility option, and slow enemies down by painting underneath them. That is a lot of tricks to have up your sleeve. It's why I find the sub weapon so fascinating and enjoyable to use. There's always some way to apply it to your current situation. In a way though, it's also the main obstacle that this sub-weapon faces for getting recognition, and why, at least I think until very recently, it hasn't been regarded as particularly useful by most players. Sure, the sub-weapon can do so much, but unlike bombs or a utility like Toxic Mist, there's no immediate, blatantly obvious, and reliable use case for it as a trade-off. On the surface, it might seem confusing to learn or find uses for on first impression. It's not until you truly dive into all its different qualities and form ideas on how to use them in tandem with the main weapons and specials that it comes with that it really starts to shine. With that, let's talk about what each angle shooter weapon, at least the 5 that currently exist, can really do with this sub, perhaps how the first 2 we got didn't really help with the sub's reputation. At the launch of the game, there were only 2 weapons with angle shooter, those being the Splattershot Pro and Jet Squelcher. Both of these weapons are rather similar. They're both long-range shooters with pretty precise accuracy, decent fire rate, and specials that remove their main and sub-weapons while active. These, at least in my opinion, played a significant part in why many players think angle shooter is weak. Consider many of the strengths and uses of angle shooter we just went over, namely things like quick paint and movement options, long range, and 35 chip damage to combo with, Let's ask ourselves what weapons like these two are exactly meant to do with these. Since these weapons are already so snappy with their movement and shots as shooter weapons, they aren't necessarily in need of something to quickly paint their feet with or get damage on their opponents when they could just shoot another shot instead. And since their specials completely take over their weapons when active, there's also long periods of time where these two weapons can't use their sub-weapon at all to begin with. By no means should you take all this as me saying angle shooter is useless on these weapons. It can still do all of the things we talked about. And having enemies marked even at long range does a lot of good for two weapons with range that want to be nailing their shots as efficiently as possible. There's also some sub and special synergy, as marking opponents with marker and then activating Crab Tank right after with Splattershot Pro can make Crab Tank even more oppressive to deal with than it normally is. The main point to be made here though is that angle shooter doesn't exactly form a new identity for these weapons, or another way of putting it is that they don't really give these two weapons tools that they were craving. Again, they're useful. They certainly could have gotten much worse options for their playstyles, but pairing this with the fact that angle shooter used to be much weaker stat-wise at launch, it's not too difficult to imagine why most players weren't too impressed with it to begin with if that was their first taste of it. Thankfully, Marker's gotten more range, paint, and damage since launch, as well as 3 additional kits at the time of this video, those weapons being the Slosher Deco, Big Swig Roller Express, and Rapid Blaster Pro Deco. All of these weapons share some traits too. These weapons are slow moving and slow firing, they have reliable chip damage and flexible hitboxes that help them reach around terrain, and they're all relatively ink hungry main weapons. The great thing for these weapons is that all of these properties are ones that angle shooter helps to mitigate if they're weaknesses, and maximize if they're strengths. First for the weaknesses are these weapons' slow fire rates and high ink consumption. Due to either hefty startup times or end lag after shots, none of Slosher, Big Swig, or Rapid Pro have a particularly efficient way to paint underneath themselves when they're trying to escape from enemy ink, since committing to a shot takes enough time that anyone fighting them can just finish them off before they can actually move again. With angle shooter being able to give an immediate pool of ink to work with though, this issue is mitigated, so when either trying to escape or push forward on an enemy in their ink, these weapons can be far more mobile and slippery than they naturally would be. The other major weakness of these weapons is their ink consumptions, with each swing of a Slosher taking 7% of your ink tank, each Rapid Pro shot 8, and each Big Swig shot 10. These weapons already don't get many shots to work with, so they especially don't want any sub-weapons that are too expensive and limit their ink management even more. And with angle shooter being the cheapest sub in the game, this isn't a big concern here either. Even if these weapons initiate all of their fights with an angle shooter, they'll still have many more shots left in the tank to use, so they're free to throw around their sub weapon as much as they please. Whereas with a more ink hungry sub like a bomb, that definitely wouldn't always be the case, at least not without a hefty investment into ink saver abilities. And the synergy with these angle shooter weapons certainly doesn't end there. Time for the big one most people think about with Marker, damage combos. Slosher, Big Swig, and Rapid Pro can all deal high damage in one hit, but aside from a very up-close vertical hit from a Big Swig, none of them can actually secure a one-shot kill. Slosher and an up-close horizontal flick from Big Swig both hit for 70 damage, and a direct shot from a Rapid Pro is 85. Certainly high damage, but again, not enough to splat outright. Normally, these weapons would have to wait at least half a second to get another shot off to finish any opponent that they hit first, but not with angle shooter. As we talked about before, a direct hit from Marker does 35, which is more than enough to combo with those 70 or 85 damage values to exceed that 100 damage benchmark for a splat, even if your opponents are wearing a sub or two of sub resistance. This makes all of these weapons much more threatening, since it's quicker for them to throw a marker then immediately shoot to combo a kill than it is for them to shoot twice in a row. In Big Swig's case, this combo also gives its vertical flicks a much further effective one-shot range. The range of Big Swig vertical normally does at least 100 damage isn't that extreme, but the range it needs to do only 65 to combo with a marker, that is far greater, so Big Swig Express can threaten quick splats from a greater range than its default counterpart. Remember too that this marker isn't only dealing damage, it's also locating its target and slowing them down with a patch of ink underneath them, which combined makes that follow-up shot from their user much easier to land, so long as they're within range. There is genuinely no running or hiding once a marker hits you directly, and what better weapons to take advantage of such a trait than these three? They can all hit easily around cover, Slosher and Big Swig with their large gravity-prone globs, and Rapid Pro with its splash damage. So even if they do miss their follow-up shot or the initial direct hit of the marker, but you still get tagged by the tail, these weapons can keep chasing you down even if you try to take cover. And this property only gets better when you consider the special weapons too. Slosher Deco has Zipcaster, enabling it to express deliver itself to you at any time, and as long as the Slosh Deco user has any idea of where you are thanks to their angle shooters, their Zipcaster positioning and movement can leverage that information and not waste a single moment with all-out aggression. Inkstorm on Big Swig Express and Killer Whale on Rapid Pro Deco can flush you out of any cover they know you're hiding behind, no matter how far away you are or how many walls stand between you and them. These two specials also deal their own chip damage, making damage combos with markers and their respective main weapons even more forgiving. And don't forget, since Inkstorm and Killer Whale users still get access to their main and sub weapons after the specials are deployed, their users also get an immediate ink tank refill that they can use to throw out even more markers or even more shots from their main weapon right after they go out. While Big Swig and Rapid Pro aren't the most inherently aggressive main weapons, due to all of this synergy with their kits, they can have a far more lethal and annoying presence on the field than they would otherwise. It's these weapons that truly made me fall in love with this sub weapon, and I hope that all of this offers even just a glimpse as to why. Now I've been going on about all the uses and combos and all that with Angle Shooter this whole time, but I want to make sure these are something you can actually put into practice in your own games. Putting my biases and experience aside, I know that all of this is much easier said than done. Angle Shooter is not an easy sub-weapon to learn how to handle. In fact, I'd argue it's one of both the highest skill floor and skill ceiling tools to ever exist in the Splatoon series. So if you want to master this sub-weapon yourself, how should you go about it? The obvious first answer is, well, to just practice it. With so many quirks and such creative potential, there really is no better way to get the hang of the sub-weapon without playing it yourself. I know I said you shouldn't use it outside of a meme build, but one night a few months ago, I spent hours in Anarchy Open with friends doing nothing but spamming markers and going for slash deco combos while using a full Inksaver sub build for triple Angle Shooter, and I honestly think that one session accelerated my growth with the sub exponentially. Again, please don't go into X rank or any serious matches with that build believing it's a good idea, but if you want to have a silly time while also forcing yourself to learn and adapt to Angle Shooter extremely quickly, playing some chill Anarchy Open or Turf War with some friends and committing to that for a couple hours really isn't a terrible way to get started. While experience is king in the end, there's a mechanic we can talk about that may help you understand Angle Shooter a bit better while trying to learn it. It's a common complaint people have that it feels like Angle Shooter doesn't go perfectly straight when you aim it, but instead goes slightly below your crosshair, especially when aiming up. This isn't just a myth either, this really does happen, but why? People say this is a bug or some faulty code, but it isn't. Instead, this is a byproduct of Splatoon being a third-person game. This was elegantly explained and portrayed by both Limitless and Hitzel on Twitter, and I'll link both of their posts below. Essentially, since your camera perspective isn't perfectly behind where your shots are generated like they would be in a first-person shooter, the game has to place your crosshair within 3D space, roughly estimating where the end of your shot should be at your max range. The exact distance of your crosshair from yourself varies from weapon to weapon, and this would be why. This is also why your crosshair's position shifts when you get near to an enemy or wall that the game predicts your shot would collide with prior to reaching their theoretical max range. Most of the time, this system works perfectly fine, but with Angle Shooter it gets a bit strange. As we said before, Angle Shooter doesn't have just a lot of range, it has the most range in the game, so there's no main weapon with a reticle far away enough from you that perfectly displays where the Angle Shooter will fly to. It's a bit more accurate with Jet Squelcher as the current longest range main weapon with Angle Shooter than it is with something like Slosh Deco by comparison, but it still isn't perfect. This is just a feature we'll have to accept, since again it's a result of how the game is fundamentally from a third person perspective. Thankfully, your reticle is still perfectly reliable for lining up your shots horizontally, and due to the ground bouncing mechanic we discussed earlier, there is some leniency in the vertical department, but this can still be finicky to learn. And that's it. That was quite a novel, so I hope it speaks for itself. Angle Shooter offers so many uses, and the value you get from it purely comes from the creative applications you come up with and how well you can execute them. Even with all I've said, I know I still have much more to learn about it. And especially with these new Sizzle Season weapons, I hope many more players join me in exploring and enjoying this sub-weapon. I've already said it all, and my voice is definitely giving out, so I hope this is enlightening. Thanks for watching, get crazy with those markers, and have a good one.